We are examining the proposed eighth principle. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Now, this is the eighth sermon in our series on the 8 principles. We've already looked at the 7 principles that are part of our Unitarian Universalist Association covenant, and today we are examining the proposed 8th principle, the first 7 principles, and we took them out of order, but I put them in order here. The inherent worth, and we covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the use of the democratic process in our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. Today, we are looking at the proposed 8th principle to our covenant. Again, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Now, the 8th principle was first proposed to the UUA in 2017 after many years of careful work and consideration. And by the way, before it went out to the UUA, it was first adopted by the UU Church of the Restoration in Philadelphia. And just this week, the Canadian Unitarians, the whole Canadian body of Unitarians, adopted the 8th principle with slightly different wording, but they adopted the 8th principle. So, yay, Canada. Since it was first proposed in 2017, many congregations have adopted it independently, and we're now considering that and it's also been before the UUA General Assembly, and it has already been accepted at one General Assembly, but since this is part of our covenant and a certain section of the bylaws, it has to be before the General Assembly a couple of times. So why are we looking at it, and why do we need it, and why do we need it now? I'm asking you, especially if you are white, cisgender, and straight, I'm asking you to listen from the margins. So what does that mean? That means I'm asking you to decenter yourself as we think about this and center those who are typically marginalized. There has been a little resistance to the 8th principle, and you've probably guessed it, it's come from white people. And the resistance has taken on typical white culture arguments. And I'm going to ask us to put those things aside and listen deeply. Now, maybe you're asking, what sort of arguments have people made against this principle? It sounds pretty good. Well, one argument is that the syntax doesn't fit with the other principles. That is a very white culture way to derail an important conversation. In fact, it is literally right out of the original OSS manual on how to derail organizations. So, you know, the OSS was the precursor to the CIA. And there's a manual that you can find on, now it's online, I think, but you can find this manual gives ways to things to do once you've infiltrated an organization, things to do to derail the organization. And it suggests that one of the things that people can do to gum up the works is by constantly focusing on details such as arguing about precision of language. Language is important to be sure, but the meaning of this principle is absolutely clear. We, as an association of congregations, are in the process of reviewing our entire covenant. We can trust that the people doing the work will come up with a way to make the words all flow together beautifully. The important thing is that we adopt this principle now and commit ourselves to the work. Another argument that some people have made is that, well, this is already covered in the first principle or the seventh principle. That's the all lives matter argument. Well, perhaps it was meant to be. But saying that we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, or that we have respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part, is not the same as calling us to action, to actively dismantle the structures of racism and oppression. That is the argument of saying, but all lives matter. And I tell you now that George Floyd was not killed because he was white, and saying all lives matter in that context is not helpful. If we want to dismantle the structures of racism and oppression, we can't say, oh, but we already affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We must work to dismantle the structures of racism and oppression. This principle has teeth. It holds us accountable to doing the work. I've heard the argument that the issue isn't racism, it's classism. Well, again, George Floyd wasn't killed because he was poor. This assumes a false duality, that something has to be either one thing or another thing. That's a very Hellenistic attitude, an ancient Greek attitude. The world is far more complicated than that. Of course, poverty is a serious issue, and it's getting worse. And it's proportionately worse for folks who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. White privilege doesn't mean that if you're white, your life hasn't been hard. It just means it hasn't been hard because you're white. We can't play colorblindness here. We can't say, oh, but race has nothing to do with it, because no one has ever been pulled over for driving while white. I have never been pulled over for driving while white. When I had a taillight out, I wasn't arrested. I was told to get it fixed. How about you? Sandra Bland died in a jail under suspicious circumstances after supposedly failing to signal a lane change. Have you ever failed to signal a lane change? Why do we need the eighth principle now? Because there is still so much work to do within the UUA and beyond. Because Cristina Rivera was forced to step down from the UUA board of Trustees after receiving anonymous, overtly racist threats to her person. Threats to her person, physical threats, and against her family. These threats didn't come from outside somewhere. They came from within Unitarian Universalism. And they were explicit in their racism. Because we are still steeped in structures of white supremacy, sometimes dressed up politely as rationalism and a deep respect for the rules that were set up for and by the white patriarchy, for the most part. The rules that were set up to keep the power structures as they were, to keep the people in power in power. Sometimes the things are hidden, but we are steeped in it, and it will not go away on its own. We need this now because right now, today, a group who is committed to maintaining the status quo of the white supremacy patriarchy is running an alternative candidate for the UUA board in the first contested election in ages. This group has used the cry of, oh, but free speech, and we must make room for all voices, to spread lies and partial truths about the most vulnerable among us. And when they have been told directly by those whom they've hurt, that what they were doing was causing harm, and when they were asked to please stop doing that, instead of coming back into covenant, they doubled down. And I am sorry and ashamed to say that this group includes a few former UU ministers, one who has now been removed from fellowship, and others who have resigned their membership or been sanctioned by the UU Ministers Association. They cry, peace, peace, but they aren't asking for peace. They're asking for people to stop saying that they've been wounded. What they're saying is, don't change anything, or the white folks might not be in charge of everything anymore. They don't want peace. What they want is for people not to make waves and not to speak up when they're being hurt. If we are serious about our faith, we must adopt this principle. We must be serious about holding ourselves accountable. We must listen when people tell us they are wounded. And this brings me to my final reason, and what I think is the most important reason of all, that we need this principle and we need it now. The reason we need the eighth principle and we need it now is because those among us who are being hurt are telling the rest of us that we need it. People are telling us that they are hurting and that we are hurting them. Now, if we are truly going to journey towards spiritual wholeness, we must adopt the eighth principle, and then we must internalize it. We must commit to doing the work. It's one thing to say, oh yeah, I believe that. But it's another to truly live our religion. We start by educating ourselves. And when I say ourselves, I do mean white people doing the work of educating white people. It is not the job of oppressed people to do the heavy lifting for the rest of us. So if you're wondering about disability advocacy, the first thing to do is not go to your disabled friend and say, hey, explain this to me. Or if you're wondering about what hurts trans people, the first thing to do is not go to your non-binary friend and say, hey, what does this mean? And if you're wondering about what hurts the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community, the first thing to do is not go to your Black friend or Indigenous friend or your friend who's a person of color and say, hey, why is this a bad thing to say? The first thing to do is educate yourself. Look it up. So I'm asking Seth to put the link to an article in the chat. And there it is, because he is right on top of this. This is a fabulous article. I found this article on the Eighth Principle UU Learning Community Facebook page. And if you're on Facebook, you can certainly join the Eighth Principle UU Learning Community Facebook page. And this is an article from 2017 by Courtney Ariel in Sojourners. And it's called For Our White Friends Desiring to Be Allies. I encourage you to read it. It talks a lot about how to be a good ally. And spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you a lot of it has to do with talking less and listening more. Aaron Burr was half right there. Talking less, listening more, and decentering ourselves and not expecting others to do the heavy lifting. So read this article, very good. Let's join other congregations who have already adopted the eighth principle. Let's adopt it here at UUCLV. And let's commit to doing the work. For it will only be then that we will be able to say that we are living out our own covenant, our UUCLV covenant of awakening the spirit, connecting in kindness, and helping to heal the world. Are you with me? Do you want to help to heal the world? If you're with me, let me get some amens there. Or yeses if you don't like amen. Are you with me in this? Can I see some hands or something in the chat? Yes? Are you with me? Are you with me? We can do this, friends. We can do this. We are good people here. We can adopt this. We can internalize this. We can make it happen. And we can help to heal the world. Namaste.